The city of Seringapatam lay under the burning southern sun, its massive walls standing like sentinels guarding the kingdom of Mysore. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, for every man, woman, and child knew that this was no ordinary day. This was the day their fate would be decided. At the heart of the city stood Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, a warrior king who had spent his life defying the might of the British Empire. His name had struck fear into the hearts of his enemies and inspired loyalty in the people who followed him. But even as his eyes scanned the horizon, watching the British troops encircle his beloved city, there was a flicker of something more in his gaze. Determination? Yes, but perhaps also the grim understanding that this would be his last stand. Tipu had not always been this larger-than-life figure, standing in the path of one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. He had inherited his throne from his father, Hyder Ali, a warrior who had carved out a kingdom in the turmoil of 18th century India. Back then, the British East India Company was spreading like wildfire, consuming kingdoms one by one, forging alliances where they could and conquering where they could not. But Mysore, under Hyder Ali and later Tipu, had resisted fiercely. Tipu dreamed not just of protecting his kingdom, but of uniting India's fractured states to drive the British out. He made alliances with the French, who shared his hatred of the British, and looked to distant powers like the Ottoman Empire for support. But he knew that at the end of the day, the fate of Mysore would be determined by his will and that of his people. The British, on the other hand, saw Mysore as a thorn in their side, a rich and strategic region that stood in the way of their total control over southern India. They had already fought 3 brutal wars with Tipu, each one bloodier than the last, and while they had inflicted damage, they had not been able to break him. But the 4th Anglo-Mysore War would be different. The British had learned from their mistakes. They came with more soldiers, more cannons, and more allies. This time, they had the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad on their side, surrounding Tipu from all directions. And leading the British forces was a young, ambitious general named Arthur Wellesley, who would later be known as the Duke of Wellington, the man who would eventually defeat Napoleon. But here in India, he had set his sights on Tipu Sultan. As the British approached Seringapatam, they came prepared for a long siege. The city, perched on an island surrounded by the Kaveri River, was one of the most well-fortified places in India. Its walls were thick, and its defenses were formidable. Tipu had ensured that every aspect of the city's defense was ready for the inevitable attack. He had even deployed his secret weapon, the rockets that had been developed by his father and improved upon during his reign. These were no ordinary fireworks. They were designed to rain destruction on the enemy from afar, exploding in midair and sowing panic among the British ranks. But as the days of the siege dragged on, the British tightened their grip on the city. Their cannons fired relentlessly at the walls, each thundering boom bringing them closer to their goal. Supplies began to run low within Seringapatam, and every soldier knew that the British had more men, more firepower, and more time. Yet Tipu did not waver. He stood at the forefront, directing his troops, encouraging them with promises of victory, even though he must have known the odds were against him. Finally, on May 4th, 1799, the day of reckoning arrived. The British had created a breach in the northern walls of the fortress after weeks of heavy bombardment. As the sun began to rise, they launched their final assault. Waves of soldiers poured through the breach, charging into the city with bayonets fixed, their red coats clashing with the stone walls of the fortress. The battle that followed was fierce. Tipu's forces fought with the desperation of men who knew they had nothing left to lose. In the narrow streets of Seringapatam, British and Mysorean soldiers clashed, swords flashing in the sunlight, gunfire echoing off the walls. In the midst of this chaos was Tipu Sultan. Clad in his warrior's armor, he fought alongside his men, refusing to flee, as some of his advisors had urged him to. He had never been a ruler to hide behind others. As the British pushed further into the city, Tipu found himself at the heart of the battle, near the breach. His soldiers, inspired by his presence, fought harder, but it was not enough. The British numbers overwhelmed them, and slowly, Tipu's forces were pushed back. And then, in the heat of the battle, Tipu was struck. A musket ball found its mark, and the Tiger of Mysore fell. But even in death, he would not let go of his sword. His body was found beneath a pile of his soldiers, still gripping the hilt, as if ready to rise and fight once more. For the British, the sight was both a victory and a haunting reminder of the formidable enemy they had faced. With Tipu Sultan's death, the resistance crumbled. The British forces swarmed the city, and what followed was a scene of plunder and chaos. Seringapatam, once the proud capital of Mysore, was looted, its treasures carried off by the victors. The British celebrated their triumph, but the cost of their victory was not lost on them. Tipu had been more than just a king. He had been a symbol of Indian resistance, a leader who had dared to stand against the greatest empire of his time. Yet, for all his ambition and courage, Tipu's legacy was not without its complications. To some, he was a hero, a patriot who fought to the bitter end to protect his people and his land. To others, he was a tyrant, a ruler who could be ruthless in his quest for power. But what cannot be denied is that his fall marked a turning point in the history of India. With the death of Tipu Sultan, the last great resistance to British rule in southern India came to an end, and the road to British dominance over the subcontinent was paved. In the years that followed, the British would restore the Wadiyar dynasty to the throne of Mysore, but the kingdom would never again enjoy the independence it once had. It became a princely state under British control, its rulers mere puppets in the hands of the empire. The dreams of a united India, free from colonial rule, would have to wait for another century. But the story of Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, did not fade into obscurity. Even in defeat, his tale was passed down from generation to generation, a reminder of the time when one man stood against an empire. In classrooms and households, in books and stories, Tipu's defiance became a legend, inspiring both admiration and debate. For children, the story of the brave king who fought till his last breath is a tale of courage. For adults, it is a reminder of the complex and often brutal history of colonialism. And so, the city of Seringapatam stands as a silent witness to the end of an era. Its walls, though battered, still echo with the memories of that fateful day in 1799 when a tiger made his last stand. From a broader historical perspective, the fall of Tipu Sultan paved the way for the British to consolidate their power over India. The Siege of Seringapatam was not just a military victory, it was a psychological blow to Indian rulers who still harbored hopes of resisting the British. The death of Tipu Sultan marked the end of an era, but it also laid the groundwork for future resistance movements. In many ways, his fall set the stage for the larger struggle for independence that would unfold over the next century. Reflecting on Tipu's death, one cannot ignore the global dimensions of his resistance. His alliances with France and the Ottoman Empire were part of a broader geopolitical struggle, one in which India was a battleground for European powers. Had Napoleon been able to offer more direct support, or had global events played out differently, the outcome of the siege might have been different. But history is often shaped by such contingencies, and in the end, Tipu Sultan's resistance, while heroic, was overwhelmed by the forces of colonial expansion. The Siege of Seringapatam is not just a story of one man's fall. It is a narrative of how empires rise and fall, of how the ambitions of one man can come into conflict with the larger forces of history. Tipu Sultan's story reminds us that resistance, even when ultimately unsuccessful, can leave a lasting legacy. His death may have marked the end of Mysore's independence, but his memory continues to inspire those who resist oppression in all its forms.